Summary of the Killers by Ernest Hemingway. In the 1920s, in a little town outside of Chicago, two odd guys wearing similar derby hats and overcoats that were too small walk into Henry's cafe and seat at the bar. Nick Adams watches them from the other side of the bar as the boss, George, tries to take their order. The guys, whose names turn out to be Max and Al, try to order a roast pork dinner, but George tells them that it's not available. Max asks why it's on the menu if they can't order it. George tells him that it's a dinner choice, and dinners aren't ready until 6 o'clock. George looks at the clock and says it's only 5 o'clock, but Max points out that the clock says 5:20. Max and Al are even more upset when George tells them that the clock is actually 20 minutes fast. Max tries to order dinner again, but George tells him that he can't do that yet and that he has to choose between sandwiches or breakfast. Max says that George is trying to hurt them on purpose when he says, "Everything we want is the dinner, eh?" Lastly, Max and Al choose some of the choices George gave them and place an order. While they're waiting for their food, Al asks what kinds of drinks they can get, which makes it sound like he wants booze. George, on the other hand, sticks to the prohibition rules of the 1920s and tells them that they can only have drinks that don't contain alcohol. Max says Summit is a hot town in a mocking way, and Al asks what people do there at night for fun. Max says in a snide way that everyone comes to the diner for the big dinner, which irritates George to the point that he says in a snide way that Max was right. In response, Al starts calling George a bright boy and then looks at Nick and asks him what his name is. Nick tells Al his name, so Al starts calling him a bright boy, too. Max and Al's food is finally brought to them by George, and they start to eat. When they are done, they suddenly tell Nick to go behind the bar and tell George to call the cook to the front of the diner. Sam, the cook, comes out for a moment before Al says he's going to take Nick and Sam back into the kitchen while Max and George stay out front. Al ties up Sam and Nick and stuffs towels in their mouths so they can't call for help. He does this in the kitchen. George asks Max what's going on in front of the diner. Max tells George that they are there to kill a Swede named Ole Anderson. Max asks George about Ole's routines, and George reluctantly says that Ole often comes to the diner at 6 o'clock for dinner. George asks Max and Al what Ole did to make them want to kill him, and Max says it's just to help a friend. Al starts to feel worried about how much Max is telling George, so he tells Max to shut up. Max tells George that if anyone comes in, he needs to tell them that the cook is sick, and if they still want food, he has to make it himself. George keeps looking at the time for the next hour. At one point, he goes back into the kitchen to make a lunch for a customer and sees Al with a shotgun that has been cut in half and Nick and Sam tied together. At 6:55, George tells Max that he doesn't think Ole is coming, but Max insists on waiting a few more minutes. Max and Al get ready to leave when Ole still doesn't show up. Al asks what they should do with the hostages before they leave. Max argues that they should be left living, even though Ole thinks it would be sloppy to do so. After Max and Al leave, George lets Sam and Nick go and tells them what Max and Al were planned. George tells Nick that he should go to Ole Anderson's boarding house and tell him about the hitmen, but Sam tells Nick to stay out of it because it ain't going to get you anywhere. Nick still goes to Ole's room to warn him, even though he has been told not to. Nick is shocked to find out that Ole already knows there are hitmen looking for him and has been planning to leave his room and let them kill him. Nick offers to call the cops or do something else to help Ole avoid dying, but Ole tells him that he's done with all that running around and is just working up the courage to leave his room. Nick keeps giving ideas, but Ole finally tells him ain't nothing to do and kicks him out. George goes back to the bar to tell George what happened. Sam won't listen to what he has to say and stays in the kitchen, but George does ask him a couple of questions and thinks for a few seconds about what an awful thing it is. George finally chooses to stop thinking about the situation. To show this, he picks up a towel and cleans the counters. Nick, on the other hand, has a hard time figuring out how he feels about the situation. He says that he can't stand to think about it. The conversation comes to a close when George gives him the response that he better not think about it.
About the author. Ernest Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois, the second of Clarence and Grace Hemingway's 6 children. Clarence Hemingway took Ernest camping and shooting with him a lot in rural Michigan. This made Ernest love the woods for the rest of his life. Hemingway played boxing and football in high school, and he also liked to write short stories for the school paper and magazine. During World War I, Hemingway joined the Red Cross in 1918 and was sent to the Italian front. He was badly hurt, so he spent the rest of the war in Milan getting better before going back to the United States. Hemingway spent most of the 1920s in Paris, where he met a group of writers called the Lost Generation by the author Gertrude Stein. When In Our Time, a collection of short stories by Hemingway, came out in 1925, he became famous almost right away. His popularity grew even more when his first book, The Sun Also Rises, came out in 1926. Hemingway was known for having a complicated love life. He divorced his first wife, Hadley, for his mistress, Pauline. A few years later, he met a journalist named Martha Gellhorn and divorced Pauline. After falling in love with Mary Welsh, he divorced Martha and stayed married to her until he died. Hemingway was famous and wealthy for many years, but his fast-paced, dangerous lifestyle and poor physical and mental health started to hurt his work and personal life. In 1961, Hemingway killed himself in Ketchum, Idaho, where he lived alone. Hemingway wrote 2 nonfiction books and 7 collections of short stories over the course of his life. After his death, more of his works, like The Garden of Eden and A Movable Feast, were released.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.